Football is constantly evolving at all levels, and embracing or building on that evolution is often what separates the good from the great when it's all said and done. Back in the early 2010s, Seattle Seahawks head coach Pete Carroll and his defensive coaching staff completely changed the way many teams play defense by building the infamous Legion of Boom, the cover 3-based secondary that was key in bringing a Lombardi trophy to Seattle in 2013. The LOB has since dissolved, and since 2015, the Seahawks have been stuck between mediocrity and dominance, especially on the offensive side of the ball, which has ushered in the Let Russ Cook movement from one of the most informed and passionate fan bases in the NFL. For years, Russell Wilson has been one of the most efficient passers in the league, but despite Wilson's efficiency, the Seattle coaching staff has maintained a run-heavy offensive philosophy. The Let Russ Cook movement is based on advanced analytics that say that passing on early downs is far more efficient than rushing on early downs. So, over the past few seasons, Seahawks fans have been begging to see an offense that's centered around their generational passer rather than an inefficient run game, and in 2020, they got it. In 2018, Seattle ran the ball 58% of the time on first and second down. Then, in 2019, they ran it 49% of the time, and in 2020, their early down run frequency dropped all the way down to 42%. The coaching staff completely changed the entire offensive philosophy to get Wilson more involved, and through the first 8 weeks of the season, their experiment seemed to work to perfection. Going into Week 9, Wilson was completing over 70% of his passes, averaging 8.4 yards per attempt with a whopping 26 touchdowns to only 6 interceptions, and an insane passer rating of 120.8. Wilson was on pace not only to win his first MVP, but also to have one of the best seasons in NFL history. It seemed like the Let Russ Cook movement had brought the Seahawks back to championship contention, but after that 6-1 start to the season, Seattle's offense was no longer such a powerhouse. In weeks 9 to 17, Wilson's completion percentage dropped by 5%, his average yards per attempt dropped by 1.5 yards, his touchdown percentage was cut in half, and his passer rating dropped 31 points. The modern analytics-based offensive approach that seemed to launch the Seahawks offense back into dominance ultimately failed last season. So today I'll explain why that happened based on what I saw on film. There were many factors that combined to cause Seattle's decrease in production halfway through the season, but before I get to the role that each of those factors played, let me first explain Seattle's structural and personnel-based modifications that were made leading up to the 2020 season. Personnel packages are defined by a 2-digit number, the first digit referring to the amount of running backs on the field and the second digit referring to the amount of tight ends on the field. So 11 personnel means 1 running back, 1 tight end, and 3 receivers. Now I want to focus on early downs because that's where we can really see the changes to Seattle's offensive philosophy. So in both 2018 and 2019, Seattle deployed 11 personnel on first and second downs over 68% of the time. Despite being by definition a run-heavy offense, they used 3 receiver sets at a very high rate. When an offense shifts from run-heavy to pass-heavy, they typically deploy more light personnel packages, increasing the rates at which they use 3 and 4 receiver sets, while decreasing the rate at which they use 2 receiver sets. But Seattle actually did the opposite. In 2020, on first and second downs, Seattle's 10 personnel usage was virtually non-existent, their 11 personnel usage decreased to under 60%, and their 12 personnel usage jumped to over 35%, which was the 4th highest rate in the league. 12 personnel is a heavy 2 receiver set, so by using it on early downs, Seattle forced defenses to respect the threat of a run, especially if they chose to match that 12 personnel set with nickel personnel on defense. And that's where we get to the main factor in Seattle's offensive regression, which is predictability. Defenses typically opted to match Seattle's 12 personnel looks with single high safety shells rather than double high safety shells in order to add an extra defender into the box for run support. And Seattle's play action attack would absolutely kill these single high looks, especially in the first half of the season. They would call crossing concepts to exploit displaced linebackers or take advantage of the single high shell by isolating one of their speedy receivers against single coverage on the outside. Here's an example from all the way back in Week 1 against Atlanta. The Falcons are in a simple cover 1, and Seattle called a concept that I've covered many times called a Yankee, where one receiver runs a go route to clear out the playside cornerback, while the other receiver runs an over route and the play-action fake takes the box defenders out of position. Post-snap safeties Keanu Neal and Ricardo Allen are both held close to the line of scrimmage by the play-action fake, while the middle linebacker follows his assignment into the flat. This opens up the middle of the field for Tyler Lockett to gain 16 yards on his over route. When you have burners like Lockett and DK Metcalf on the outside, play-action crossing concepts like Yankee will absolutely kill cover 1 all day because in cover 1, the linebackers aren't even trying to work back to cover the middle of the field. And even the best corners in the league can't be expected to cover fast receivers running over routes while on an island. These concepts will kill cover 3 defenses as well when the linebackers are displaced enough, which you can see here against Minnesota. Because Greg Olsen wasn't followed in his pre-snap motion and the defense presents a single high safety shell, Seattle knows that cover 3 is likely. So they call a Yankee concept with a deep post from Lockett and a drift route from Metcalf. Post-snap, the linebackers are sucked up by the play-action fake, which opens up the middle of the field for Metcalf as he breaks inside. Now, the difference between calling cover 1 and cover 3 against these Yankee concepts is in cover 3, the linebackers are usually responsible for working back over the middle to help cover the over routes, whereas in cover 1, the linebackers are responsible for covering a given receiver. In the second half of the season, defenses called less cover 1 and more cover 3 in order to allow their linebackers to work back and find those crossing routes, while continuing to keep an extra defender in the box by using a single high safety shell. In weeks 1 to 8, defenses called cover 1 about 29% of the time, and cover 3 about 24% of the time. But in weeks 9 to 17, cover 1 usage dropped to under 16%, and cover 3 usage jumped to over 30%. Defenses stopped forcing their corners to cover crossing routes all alone without a leverage advantage, and began relying on one of their linebackers to stay put and undercut the cross. These play-action crossing concepts only work when the linebackers responsible for the middle of the field are displaced. So when the offense doesn't present a significant run threat, one of those linebackers can just drop into coverage. When offenses become more pass-heavy, defenses will become more ambiguous post-snap because passing the ball at a high rate makes it much easier for them to disguise their coverages. And as great as Russell Wilson is, he does sometimes struggle with post-snap coverage recognition. When Wilson gets something completely different from what he expected pre-snap, he scrambles impulsively, and you can't really blame him considering the subpar offensive line play that he's been dealing with for his entire career. Some of Wilson's best plays are made while playing outside of structure, but last season he would often break plays too early. Here's an example from week 15 against Washington. Pre-snap, Wilson sees a single high safety shell and knows that Washington is likely in zone coverage because Lockett wasn't followed during his pre-snap motion. Those two things tell Wilson that the defense is probably in cover 3, so he knows exactly what he's going to do post-snap if his cover 3 assumption is correct. Lockett is running a quick hitch on the outside, while tight end Will Dissly is running a divide route down the seam, and Chris Carson is running a flat route to the boundary. In a typical cover 3, the strong safety would take a sky rotation to the flat, but match coverage rules would tell him to match the tight end vertically to prevent a big play down the seam, while the outside corner takes Lockett on the hitch, which would leave Chris Carson wide open in the flat with room to run after the catch. Instead of playing cover 3 with a sky rotation from the strong safety though, the defense rolls into a Tampa 2 with a cloud rotation from the strong safety. So the Mike can carry the tight end down the seam, while the Sam takes the hitch and the outside corner takes the flat. This somewhat creative coverage rotation from the Washington defense covered up the concept to Wilson's right, but he had his tight end on the other side, Jacob Hollister, wide open for a first down. There's a difference between extending the play within structure and abandoning structure to improvise. Wilson is a phenomenal improvisational playmaker. Some of his best highlights come from those situations, and he's often the difference between a big play and a sack when things break down. However, he's not great at staying within structure late in the down, and that weakness is not totally on him. Considering the offensive line play that Wilson has been forced to become accustomed to so far in his career, it's no surprise that he feels the need to scramble impulsively and leave the pocket when he doesn't get what he expected from the defense post-snap. The Seattle front line isn't built for a pass-heavy offensive scheme, which is another one of the many reasons why the Let Russ Cook movement went as fast as it came. Quick philosophical transformations on either side of the ball, like the Let Russ Cook movement, often see early success, but are rarely sustainable, which is unfortunately the case for the 2020 Seahawks. The coaching staff's willingness to welcome new ideas is admirable, but offensive line play, failure to respond to defensive adjustments, and overall predictability prevented Seattle from moving back into Super Bowl contention, and we may never see an offensive philosophy that allows Wilson to pass at such a high rate again. The Seattle front office fired offensive coordinator Brian Schottenheimer after the 2020 season, citing philosophical differences, and proceeded to hire former LA Rams offensive coordinator Shane Waldron, who will likely implement a wide zone Shanahan-style offensive scheme that isn't pass-heavy, but will make defenses more predictable and will take some of the pressure off Russell Wilson. The Let Russ Cook movement failed in 2020, but despite its failure, there is a lot that can be learned from it, a lot that Seattle can build on in order to finally maximize their offensive efficiency.